Welcome to the MassTLC Security Community Coffee With, featuring members of the community sharing their insights and perspectives on pressing security issues and security operations for your company. I'd like to thank the security community sponsors, Devo, Nuance, PwC, and Vectra, and the MassTLC global sponsors for supporting our efforts throughout the year.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Coffee With series with the MassTLC. My name is Kevin O'Brien. I am the CEO and co-founder of GreatHorn. We're a cloud-native email security company based in the Boston area. And I'm also a member of the Security Council with the Mass Technology Leadership Council. And we've been doing a series of these informal conversations with security leaders around the area. And it's my pleasure to be joined today by Stephen Boyer. Stephen is the CTO and co-founder at BitSight. And as I think back, Stephen, I think you and I met, I want to say in like 2013. I think that we first crossed paths. Yeah, it's been a while. Stephen and the team are obviously a member of the MassTLC and also a big name in the security landscape in Massachusetts. And what we're going to talk about today is an informal conversation around risk. And we were just having a discussion before we hit record. And the thing that came up, and I'll turn it over to you to maybe comment on, Stephen, is I think we're in this moment when I talk to CISOs, what I'm hearing is that there is a shift in thinking that's occurring, that's been occurring for a long time, but it's the shift from thinking about security as a technology play where I go and plug holes in my infrastructure and think about detection. How do I detect bad things? To a risk posture. And how do I think about holistic risk, both internal and external, both for my organization and my supply chain? I'm sure that's a topic that is relevant to you. What are you seeing and what are you hearing from the CISOs that you're working with?
Yeah, so Kevin, I think you articulated it super well. It is something that we're seeing, and some has been a little bit of a result of some of the investments and partnerships that you'll have seen announced publicly. But it fits into this rubric what we call a little bit of the professionalization of the CISO or the security and risk executive, which is historically grown up on the technical side, but now meeting the demands of the business side and needing to be able to speak the language of the business to be able to set priorities of the business that it may pertain to protecting the business, enabling it to go more digital, et cetera, and then being able to steer, right? Because things change. And so to be able to have those conversations is usually done in terms of dollars or euros or pick your currency for almost every other part of the business. And so what we're seeing is this moment where cybersecurity is what one of our customers said is starting to grow up. And so what we mean by that is just that level of sophistication to be able to understand that it's not a binary, are you secure or not? There's a distribution of outcomes, and there are distributions of losses that you need to be able to think about. And then you need to have those conversations at the executive or board level around what's our risk tolerance, right? It can't be zero because we have to do business. We have to let our users log in and we have to provide services. But where do we sit on that curve? And then we need to be able to invest accordingly. And so I think those are different conversations that not everyone's comfortable having. I think it's still early days on how that works, but the business is now demanding it. And I think that's probably one of the big shifts is, hey, we can't just give you infinite budget to just do everything. So what are we going to do, and where are we going to spend our resources, and what kind of return should we expect? And that gets you to the very tough ROI and security, but that's really where things are going, is you'll need to be able to show that, and maybe not definitively, but over a range of different outcomes. And that's where risk has been in supply chain, risk has been in financial models, and I think you're just going to have to see that more and more in cybersecurity, because it is now an integrated part of the business. It's not just like, now we're going to think about cybersecurity. It's integrated in every part of the business. So it's not just like one chunk you need to think about. You need to think about how we integrate it, how we do business. And I would say over the last year and a half to 2 years, with the mass adoption of digital technologies through outsourcing, or what oftentimes people call digital transformation, every business to survive had to move some amount digital, which introduced some risk, right? And I think when somebody asks you how much risk do we introduce, people have struggled there. And so I think that's where the conversations will shift into much more business level conversations that are going to require you to speak the language of the business, help set the priorities, and then drive and steer as things change and develop.
I think what's interesting about that evolution is that by shifting from a technology-focused modality to a risk-focused modality, one of the things that I hear and see is that we're starting to talk about behavioral modification, right? So instead of saying, I'm going to go buy a bunch of things, I was talking to a CISO this morning who told me I have 30 different security vendors that I'm working with. And, it's almost a cliche to talk about the overabundance of vendors that organizations work with. But there's this idea now that instead of just saying, well, what's in the market and what do the vendors tell me I need to go do and think about, there's this idea that I'm hearing around what is the desired end state? And it is a component of risk, a component of what we want to do. And then how do I nudge behaviors, both for people, but also for the architects of my technology systems to get us there? Are you seeing the same thing happening?
Exactly. I'd say outcome-based is the same thing. I think we've been talking about consolidation in the cybersecurity market for forever. And I don't know if it'll ever quite happen because there are needs and niches that groups are growing to help serve. But I do really like this. Let's start with where we're going to go, as opposed to I need one of X, Y, and Z. Right. And I think, and then how does that relate to us? And there will be some things that will be pretty foundational, but there may be some things that are very sector specific or maybe very business specific, and they can prioritize that a little bit differently. And so instead of saying I need all 30 of those widgets or capabilities, and they may, if it's the right thing, but how do we prioritize that? And we may spend all of our time on these things because we see that that is 90% of the risk. And so there will be this long tail of other things that we should be doing. But if we can all agree that our business is mostly dependent there, if we see that being the issue, then we're going to focus on that one. I'll take one from your playbook. Phishing is just hammering people, right? Just still hammering people. It's like that's a huge business risk because that'll lead to ransomware and credential loss and business email compromise. There's are we sufficiently invested there? Do we see that, or are we spending time in other areas where we don't see the risk? So I think that's where the conversations will go. Is what outcome and desired state based on our risk appetite are we going to go? And we hope that will drive investment conversations, as opposed to here's our maturity scale, which could be kind of risk agnostic, where it says, okay, now here's where the risks are. Yes, our maturity scale, we want to get to 5, but really we're fine at being 4 point whatever if we really address what we believe is the largest business risk.
So the last question that I'd asked then is how do you quantify that? And what we typically are starting to see now is a conversation around an external measurement of risk being tied out to insurance policies, or obviously some of what BitSight provides for organizations when they think about assessing vendor chain risk, et cetera. Anything that you're seeing that's changing there?
Yeah, so I'd say we've been focused on performance measurements, principally gained from the outside for a while. Where we're seeing and we're investing pretty heavily is an area called cyber risk quantification. Had a lot of different terms. You've heard maybe cyber value at risk, but CRQ is the term that the industry is starting to coalesce around, which is really taking those scenarios and those outcomes and trying to put dollar loss values against that, and not just Monte Carlo make it up, but cross-check that against real losses. All right, so now we've got enough to where we have real loss scenarios that will give you a distribution. Now, some of that's backward looking, so you're kind of tied to some of the stuff that's backward looking, and there are future things, but that's a pretty good indicator right now that we know. You pick a scenario, ransomware. We know roughly what the distributions of losses are there, what it's going to cost you to get incident response and to notify and to deal with legal. And so you can start putting some nice bounds around this. So when you're talking about, hey, we think we're going to spend X millions on an email protection system, we think it's going to reduce our annual expected loss by 20 million.
That's the
right? And now you're like, it's like, oh, of course we would do that, right? And it's like, actually, what if I gave you 5 million? What could we do? It's like, actually, we could cut it and now only have a third of that. So that's where I think the language is going to start to go, is to this language of cyber risk quantification. It's been missing oftentimes because the data have been missing and the granularity, but also just familiarity. So it's still a nascent area, but I see that as it's already happening in cyber insurance, as they have been hit pretty hard with losses, and so they've had to get much more sophisticated, and so they are looking at their historical loss data, and they're trying to pull in as much information as they can to have pretty informed models, and that's how they're writing policy and managing their book. And what you'll see is now a lot of security and risk leaders I'm talking to, their insurance premiums are going up, not like by 10%, by like 2 to 3x. And part of it is because the risk is getting priced in, but now they need to be able to come back on that and say, hey, is this the right, do we need to transfer that much risk, or are we okay? Do we feel like we're okay and we can reduce some of our limits? So I think that's what I mean about the business conversation. So as you start to be able to quantify the risks in the language of some sort of currency, it just changes that conversation. So I'd say that's where we see a lot of new investment happening, and there's definitely a lot of demand. And there have been people doing it for a little while. It's just been tough to scale that and to make it very model driven and have the kind of data to drive that. And so I think that's where you'll see a next wave of investment and capability.
I think we'll leave it there. Stephen, thank you so much for joining. It's a great conversation. And if you're interested in learning more, BitSight.com.
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you for watching Coffee With. Thank you again to our security community sponsors, Devo, Nuance, PwC, and Vectra, and to the MassTLC global sponsors.